Imagine this. You're drifting off to sleep on a cold December night, and suddenly you hear a gentle tapping on your window. You pull back the curtains, and there, pressed against the glass, is a red and white striped claw. The strangest part isn't the claw itself. It's the soft jingling sound you hear in the background, like tiny bells echoing in the darkness. Before you can blink, the claw scrapes down the window, leaving a trail of crimson streaks. If you're intrigued or unsettled by this image, keep listening because tonight's tale might just be what you need for a dose of holiday horror. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know if you've ever had a creepy winter experience of your own, and tell me what kind of stories you'd like to hear next. I always love hearing from you. Now, on to the story. I was 12 years old the first time I heard the phrase, candy cane claws. It was a cold afternoon in late November, and the sun was already dropping behind the line of frosty pine trees near my school. My best friend, who I'll call Eric, had just finished telling me a supposedly true story about a mysterious figure who roamed the old orchard at the edge of town. According to Eric, this being looked like a half-frozen man wearing a tattered Santa suit, but instead of normal hands, it had these elongated claws that were red and white striped, exactly like a candy cane. He called them candy cane claws. Of course, I didn't believe him. I teased Eric, saying he was just making up some nonsense to get attention. But Eric insisted he'd seen it with his own eyes one night when he snuck out to watch shooting stars. He described hearing a scraping sound, like metal dragging against bark, and then glimpsed a flash of red and white at the corner of his vision. Something tall and gaunt, swaying back and forth under the moonlight, occasionally raking its claws against a tree trunk. I laughed it off and said something about how he should write a horror novel. But the look in Eric's eyes wasn't one of a kid who just told a random fib. It was more like genuine fear, a flicker of trauma that made me uneasy. I dropped the subject, and we rode our bikes back home in silence. A few days later, we had Thanksgiving break. By then, I'd nearly forgotten about Eric's story, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. But over the next month, strange rumors started circulating around town. Some people talked about how the orchard trees looked like they'd been carved into with giant stripes, literally big, deep gashes that spiraled around trunks like the pattern on a candy cane. Others swore they found footprints in the snow that looked almost human except for the extended point at the front, as if a single sharp talon marked the toes. A local newspaper even published a small piece about it, calling it a festive vandal or a holiday prankster. Everyone was on edge in a weird, half-joking way. On the one hand, it sounded silly. Who would believe in a creature with candy cane-striped claws? But on the other hand, the evidence, scratches, footprints, even a few shaky photos of weird silhouettes in the orchard, kept piling up. Every so often, I'd catch someone mumbling that it might be candy cane claws. Eric's parents, ironically, weren't fazed. They told him to stay out of the orchard because it was private property. My own parents said the same thing, reminding me how one of the orchard owners was known to chase off trespassers with rock salt in a shotgun. The orchard had a real spooky vibe even before these rumors started, so it wasn't exactly a neighborhood hangout. Still, curiosity got the better of me, and one evening I found myself sneaking out of my bedroom window to head toward that orchard. Eric and I had agreed we'd meet at the corner of Wilton Drive and Maple Crescent, which was the last lit street before the fields. I remember the crunch of snow under my boots, the orange glow of the streetlights, and the sense that something about that night was off. The air was too still, too cold, and my breath came out in white puffs that hung around longer than usual. Eric was waiting for me, bundled up in a thick coat, a wool hat, and a scarf wrapped around half his face. He looked terrified already. Without speaking much, we crept along the dim path until we reached the rotting wooden fence that separated town from the orchard. The orchard was old, spanning acres of land. Rows upon rows of gnarled apple trees were bare of leaves, their twisted limbs stretching into the sky like skeletal arms. The moon was bright enough to illuminate most of the area, and we could see the occasional flicker of motion in our peripheral vision. Probably just branches moving in the faint wind, but it set our nerves on edge. For a while, nothing happened. We inched deeper, staying close together, my flashlight scanning the trunks. I almost laughed at myself for coming out there, thinking maybe we'd scare each other for 10 minutes and go home. Then Eric pointed to something on the ground. It was a set of footprints in the snow, leading between two rows of trees. At first, they seemed normal, but then I realized each print elongated at the front, forming a razor-sharp point. My heart pounded. The prints were fresh enough that they still had crisp edges, and they led away into the deeper part of the orchard. With our bravado fading, we followed them, feeling both excitement and dread. We moved slowly, heads on a swivel, listening for anything besides our own breaths and the crunch of snow underfoot. After about 10 minutes, we found a tree with distinct spiraling gashes around the trunk, exactly like a candy cane. The marks were deep, the inner wood revealed in long stripes. That's when Eric whispered, "I told you." Before I could respond, there was this faint scratching sound from somewhere behind us. It echoed lightly through the orchard, almost like nails scraping wood. We killed the flashlight and crouched down, hearts hammering. The orchard went still again. Then the sound came once more, a little closer. It was followed by a soft jingling noise, like tiny bells. I felt an electric jolt of terror run up my spine. My logical brain fought against the idea of something with bell-adorned, peppermint-striped claws stalking us, but at that moment, it didn't feel so impossible. Eric grabbed my arm, motioning for us to retreat. We moved slowly backward, trying not to step on branches that would crack. The scratching came again, louder this time, followed by a rustling of branches. In the moonlight, I caught a glimpse of movement, a tall figure weaving between the trees. My immediate thought was that it had to be someone playing a twisted prank. Then I saw something glint in the moonlight, something long and curved. It looked like the shape of a scythe or a blade, but in candy cane colors, red and white spirals that seemed to catch every beam of moonlight and send it dancing across the snow. Eric panicked and broke into a run, yanking me along with him. Our footsteps thundered through the orchard as we trampled the snow. My lungs burned from the icy air, and my heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. Behind us, I swear I heard a distant laugh, a guttural, choking kind of laugh that sent my blood cold. That was all the encouragement we needed to run faster. We managed to leap over the fence and land back on the street, stumbling, hearts racing. We didn't stop until we were safely beneath a streetlight, panting clouds of vapor into the air. That night, we swore never to speak of it again, never to go back there. And for a while, we kept our promise. Time passed. Christmas came and went, then years rolled by, and eventually Eric and I grew apart. He moved away for college. I stayed in town, working odd jobs until I finally took a position with the local post office. I never forgot that night, though. Every winter, whenever I'd see candy canes or hear Christmas music, I'd remember that silhouette, the spiral gouges on the tree, the footprints in the snow. It became almost like an urban legend in my own mind. Something I'd questioned whether it really happened or if fear and imagination had distorted an ordinary moment. I was 23 when everything came back full force. I was on a mail route near the orchard, still privately owned, but now mostly abandoned. The old farmer had passed away, and the property was in legal limbo. The orchard fences were in disrepair, the trees even more twisted with time. It was mid-December, and fresh snowfall blanketed the area. I couldn't resist walking a little bit off the main road to look inside. I recalled that night from my childhood, the footprints, the laughter, the claws. I felt foolish even thinking about it, but as I stood by the broken fence, I noticed fresh marks on the wood. They looked like stripes again, these deep gouges that ran in a neat spiral, as if some giant candy cane had raked across it. A chill ran through me. There was no reason for an animal to scratch in a perfect spiral. Vandals? Possibly. But who would do that, especially in sub-zero temperatures, all the way out there? My instincts screamed at me to leave, but a part of me needed to know if it was still out there. the thing we had called candy cane Claus. I rationalized it, telling myself I was just investigating some vandalism. Still in my postal uniform, I hopped over the fence, wincing at the cold bite of the wind on my exposed hands. The orchard looked eerily quiet, the ground thick with undisturbed snow. I took a few cautious steps, scanning for footprints. At first, I saw nothing but smooth, white drifts. Then, about 15 yards in, I spotted them. They were the same kind of prints I'd seen years ago. Shallow at the heel, pointed at the toes, too elongated to be any normal boot. The stride was long, as if the creature or person who made them was quite tall. They led deeper into the orchard, weaving between the trees. The orchard silence made every nerve in my body tingle. Even crows and squirrels seemed to have abandoned the place. My breath came out in foggy bursts, and I gripped my mail satchel like it was some kind of shield. Following the footprints, I soon found more striped gashes carved into the trunks. Each tree bore fresh wounds, the bark peeling back in red-brown flakes. It almost looked like some twisted holiday pattern. As I ventured farther, I began to hear that faint jingling sound, like tiny bells. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it, or that it was just the wind stirring something metallic. But it grew louder, more distinct. A wave of déjà vu washed over me. I was back to being 12, trembling in the moonlight with Eric by my side. Except this time, I was alone. I had a sudden urge to turn and run, but I forced myself to push on, adrenaline masking the cold sting. The footprints led me to a clearing among the apple trees. There, scattered in the snow, were broken candy canes. Full-sized, twisted red and white candy canes, some snapped in half, some gnawed on, with bits of peppermint scattered on the ground. Who would do that here? Why? My heart pounded. That's when I saw it. Something moving among the trees on the far side of the clearing. It was tall, skeletal in build, covered in what looked like a ragged coat with tattered fur at the edges. And its arms ended in impossibly long candy cane claws, each striped red and white, glinting in the weak winter sunlight. I froze, watching in horror as the figure seemed to scuttle around a tree trunk, occasionally dragging a claw along the bark. That scraping sound made my stomach turn. Then it raised its head, and I saw what looked like a face hidden beneath a hood or cowl, the features obscured in shadow. But I could feel its stare piercing right through me. For a terrifying moment, I thought it was about to rush at me, but it just stood there, swaying side to side, as if deciding what to do. The jingling sound was steady now, like bells attached to a belt or something on its body. My mind screamed at me to run, but a morbid curiosity pinned me in place. After several seconds, which felt like an eternity, I took a shaky step backward, and the creature tilted its head. Then it let out a soft, rasping chuckle. It sounded like it was choking on laughter. That was all I needed. I spun on my heel and sprinted back the way I came, stumbling over roots hidden by snowdrifts. My lungs felt like they would explode. I burst back onto the road, half expecting it to chase me, but when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing. The orchard was silent once again, like a tomb. I didn't mention it to anyone at first, partly out of fear of being ridiculed, and partly out of a sense that acknowledging it would somehow make it more real. But the next day, something bizarre happened at the post office. Several other carriers reported odd complaints from residents. People found their holiday wreaths slashed in neat, spiral cuts. Someone else said they discovered candy cane fragments near their dog's kennel. More than one person mentioned hearing little bell sounds at odd hours of the night. Curiosity overcame my fear, and I started quietly asking around, collecting stories that matched what Eric had first told me all those years ago. A retired teacher mentioned seeing a tall man with striped sides for arms in her backyard. A group of teenagers claimed they saw a hunched figure lurking near the park, holding a large striped stick that looked like a weapon. Each story was eerily similar. The entity was tall, wore something like a ragged winter coat, had claws or blades with red and white stripes, and seemed to appear right at the beginning of December. A few described that chilling chuckle. Others mentioned the jingling. No one knew what it was or where it came from. Folks were too scared or too embarrassed to tell the police. And anyway, what would they say? A monstrous Santa-like creature with candy cane claws was roaming the town? I debated contacting Eric about it, but I'd lost touch with him after he moved. Eventually, I found his number through an old friend and gave him a call. He picked up, and after some awkward small talk, I blurted out that I thought Candy Cane Claus was back. He went silent for a long moment, then quietly said he'd known it would happen someday. He'd moved away partly to get away from those nightmares. He asked if I remembered the orchard, the footprints, all those years ago. I told him I'd seen it up close this time. He sounded both terrified and strangely vindicated, as if his childhood fears had finally been validated. But he also told me something new. He'd done research and found references in obscure local legends about a spirit or entity connected to winter solstice festivities, known to punish children who wandered into restricted places. The creature was said to be a twisted manifestation of holiday greed or mischief. In some stories, it was a man cursed for wrongdoing. In others, it was a demonic presence that only took form during the darkest nights of the year. Eric believed that the orchard might have been some sort of boundary point, a gateway or a place where the barriers between our world and something else were thin. Encouraged by my phone call with Eric, I decided to dig deeper. I visited the local library, combing through old newspapers. There were scattered references dating back decades, even a century, about striped talons and claws like peppermint sticks haunting the area. Sometimes it was near the orchard, sometimes near the old train tracks, sometimes near the frozen creek. Almost always in December. The sightings were rare and spaced out by years. I found old letters to the editor, sensational headlines about winter's monster, and diaries from past residents complaining about stolen livestock or carved barn doors. It was like a cursed folktale that never fully went away. By the time I left the library, dusk had settled and the wind howled outside. Every nerve in me was on edge, expecting the creature to appear around every corner. I hurried home, triple-checking my doors and windows. I curled up in bed, but the howling wind seemed to carry that faint jingling sound, or maybe I was just paranoid. Even so, I barely slept, haunted by the memory of its gaunt silhouette. The very next day, I woke up to a phone call from one of my co-workers, Jen, who was absolutely frantic. She said that something had broken into her garage overnight. The door looked like it had been slashed with giant claws in a spiral pattern. Inside, her old Christmas decorations were torn apart. The only thing not destroyed was a small bowl of candy canes she kept on a shelf. Those were placed neatly in a line, each candy cane broken in half, as though methodically snapped. Jen was shaken to the core, certain it wasn't a break-in by a regular human vandal. She'd heard the bell sounds too, around 3 a.m. I felt my stomach drop. I tried to reassure her, but I wasn't sure what to say. I drove over to her house to see the damage for myself. Sure enough, the garage door had deep spiral gashes. The metal was shredded, leaving bits of twisted steel scattered on the concrete. There was no sign of forced entry on the main door, no footprints in the snow outside because a light flurry had fallen overnight. But inside, the wreckage spoke for itself. Who, or what, would target holiday decorations and arrange broken candy canes in a neat row? Jen wanted to call the police, but I had no clue how they'd react. Still, we called them. An officer came, took photos, and promised to file a report. But you could see it in his eyes. He thought we were messing with him, or that it was some bizarre neighborhood prank. He left with a half-hearted promise to keep an eye out. December marched on, and sightings became more frequent. Houses near the orchard reported tapping on their windows at odd hours. People found candy cane fragments shoved under door handles or in mailboxes. A jogger saw a tall figure scraping its claws on a lamppost before vanishing into the shadows. Social media lit up with unconfirmed videos. A shaky clip of a tall shape crossing a snowy road. Another weird claw marks on a playground slide. The local kids began daring each other to go out at night to hunt candy cane claws, but thankfully none seemed brave or foolish enough to actually do it. Fear was gripping the community, even if half of us were still in denial. An elderly woman named Mrs. Tanner, who lived close to the orchard, claimed she'd actually spoken to the creature. According to her, it appeared in her backyard one night, scraping its claws on her fence while she watched from her back window. She opened the window just a crack and asked what it wanted. She told me it paused, turned its head, and though she couldn't see its face, she heard a raspy whisper. To feed. She promptly slammed her window. That story chilled me, but I couldn't be sure if her memory was reliable. Still, the orchard fence was indeed carved up the next day. Determined to end this once and for all, I decided I'd have to confront whatever it was directly. Fear was one thing, but this was personal now. It felt like it was terrorizing my friends, my neighbors, and my hometown. I reached out to Eric again, asking if he'd be willing to return. He was hesitant, but eventually agreed. He arrived a week before Christmas. We spent that time prepping. We gathered flashlights, cameras, and even some improvised self-defense tools, though we had no idea if they'd be effective against candy cane claws. Our plan was to stake out the orchard, the place where we'd first seen it, figuring that was its territory. If we could get proof, maybe we could rally the town to take serious action, whatever that might be. So on December 20th, with a bright moon overhead, Eric and I snuck into the orchard once again. It felt surreal returning to that place after so many years. The trees were even more twisted, and the cold was biting. We set up a small camera on a tripod near the clearing, where I'd found the broken candy canes. Then we took cover behind a cluster of thick trunks, shivering in the freezing air. For hours, we saw nothing. My legs went numb from crouching, and my breath formed clouds so thick I had to wipe frost from my eyebrows. Eric kept checking his phone, probably to keep track of time or distract himself from the fear. Just as we started to think the night would end in disappointment, the jingling came. Soft, intermittent. My stomach lurched. Eric clutched my arm, and I nodded silently to him. We inched closer to the clearing, trying to keep ourselves concealed. There, illuminated by moonlight, was the creature, Candy Cane Claus. This time, we had a clear view. Its form was lanky, draped in tattered, fur-lined cloth that might have once been a festive coat. The legs were long, ending in what looked like pointed boots or hooves. We couldn't tell. But the arms, each ended in elongated, razor-sharp claws patterned with red and white stripes. They looked like they were made of polished bone or hardened candy. A soft shimmer glinted off them each time the creature moved. Eric fumbled with his phone camera, trying to capture it on video. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The creature tilted its head upward, as if sniffing the air. Then it moved toward the camera we'd set up, which was partially hidden behind some bushes. It noticed it almost immediately. With a horrifying screech, it raised one arm and brought the claw down on the camera tripod, smashing it in a single blow. The metal snapped like a twig. Our one chance at hard evidence was gone in an instant. Panicking, Eric stepped on a branch and it cracked. The creature's head whipped around, and though the moonlight didn't reveal its face fully, I felt its gaze lock onto us. Time seemed to slow. We had nowhere to run without crossing open ground in the clearing. The creature let out a low growl, almost a hiss. Then, impossibly fast, it lunged. Its limbs moved with a jerky grace, like a spider scuttling over a web. We dove in opposite directions behind two thick tree trunks. The orchard erupted in chaos. The thing slashed at branches, sending shards of wood flying. I heard Eric shout in pain as one of the shards grazed his arm. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline surging, and I grabbed the nearest fallen branch to use as a makeshift club. The creature swung its claw at me, narrowly missing my shoulder. I felt a rush of cold air as it sliced through. I swung the branch blindly, hitting its side. It let out a guttural cry but didn't seem hurt by the impact. Instead, it turned that twisted face toward me, and I got a glimpse of sunken, dark sockets where eyes should be. I nearly dropped the branch in horror. Eric tackled the creature from behind, or tried to, but it shook him off with a violent thrash. He was thrown against a tree, gasping for air. I gritted my teeth and swung the branch again, aiming for its claws, hoping to snap them. To my shock, the impact made a ringing sound like hitting porcelain. The creature recoiled, not in pain but in apparent annoyance. Then, with lightning speed, it brought its candy cane claw down on the branch, splitting it in two. My improvised weapon was useless now. With both of us cornered, it stepped back, as if reveling in our helplessness. Then it raised its arms in a strangely ceremonious gesture. That's when I noticed dozens of broken candy canes scattered around the clearing, half buried in snow, like it had been collecting them. The creature let out that raspy chuckle again. For a moment, I thought we were finished. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw headlights. My friend Jen, worried about us, had driven her SUV onto the roadside near the orchard and was shining the beams into the field. The sudden light must have startled the creature, because it hissed and skidded away into the darkness of the orchard. Breathing heavily, Eric and I stumbled back to Jen's vehicle, bruised and shaken. We didn't get any footage. Our camera was destroyed, and Eric's phone was smashed in the scuffle. But we had new wounds and shattered nerves as proof. Jen was horrified by our condition. She tried to call an ambulance, but we insisted we were okay, just scratched and bruised. Eric's arm had a nasty cut, though, and he needed stitches eventually. Word spread quickly among our small circle, and soon enough, half the town was buzzing with rumors. Some folks started forming neighborhood watch groups. Others told stories of how their grandparents had faced this creature decades ago, driving it off with bright lights and strong will. But the sightings only escalated, as if the creature was enraged by our confrontation. It appeared more frequently, leaving behind deeper claw marks, twisted candy canes, and occasionally that unsettling laughter in the night. Christmas Eve came, bringing a heavier snowfall. Many families stayed indoors, windows shuttered, refusing to participate in the usual holiday cheer. The streets felt deserted, aside from the swirling snow. Around midnight, I heard frantic knocks on my door. It was Mrs. Tanner's neighbor, saying she saw something by Mrs. Tanner's window. I grabbed a flashlight and rushed over, joined by a few other neighbors. The house was dark. We called out for her, but no one answered. We found the back door ajar, snow blowing in. As we stepped inside, we saw the living room was in disarray. Furniture overturned, pictures smashed. By the window, the floor was covered in candy cane fragments, arranged in a spiral pattern. Mrs. Tanner was gone. No sign of her anywhere. We searched the entire property, inside and out. All we found was a single thick piece of spiral marked with near a puddle of melted snow. That was the last time Mrs. Tanner was seen. The official story was that she wandered off in confusion, but we knew better. The creature had taken her. Or worse. Panic set in. Some people fled town to spend Christmas with relatives elsewhere. Others holed up, armed themselves with whatever they could. My own parents left to visit my aunt. I stayed, driven by a desperate need to see this through. Eric had planned to leave, but after Mrs. Tanner disappeared, he felt guilty running away. He stayed with me at my house, both of us on high alert every night. In the early hours of December 26th, the night after Christmas, I awoke to a soft tapping on my bedroom window. My heart raced. Eric was in the guest room, presumably asleep. I crept toward the window, trying to peer through the frosty glass. Then I heard it, the faint jingling of bells coming from just outside. In a flash, I grabbed a baseball bat and rushed out of my room, determined not to let it corner me inside. I shouted for Eric as I made my way to the living room. He emerged half awake, holding a fireplace poker. We flipped on every light, scanning the windows. The tapping started again, this time at the back door. We exchanged a terrified glance. Moving as one, we approached the back door, which was glass-paneled. Outside, illuminated by the porch light, was the outline of Candy Cane Claus. It stood there, almost calmly, one striped claw tapping the glass. My breath caught in my throat. Then it pressed its face close to the glass. And for the first time, I saw more detail than I ever wanted. The skin, or whatever covered its face, was chalk white and cracked like old plaster. Its eyes were black hollows, no pupils visible. The mouth was twisted, the lips drawn back in a parody of a grin, revealing sharp, irregular teeth. It fogged up the glass with each breath, though it made no normal breathing sound. Instead, it let out a faint, scraping hiss, as if each breath was pulled through a broken windpipe. Eric let out a startled yelp, and the creature slammed a claw against the glass. A thin crack spread across the pane. We realized it would smash through any second. We scrambled to block the door with the couch, just as the glass gave way in a cascading burst of shards. The creature's arm thrust through the opening, those red and white claws swiping wildly. One claw caught Eric's shoulder, drawing blood. He cried out and fell back. I swung the baseball bat, hitting the creature's arm, but it only retracted momentarily before lunging again, jamming its claws further into the house. The jingling grew louder, like the bells were in a frenzy. Desperate, I shouted for Eric to grab the salt we kept for melting ice. He scooped up a small bucket of rock salt from near the front door. With trembling hands, he threw a handful directly at the creature's outstretched arm. The reaction was immediate. The creature recoiled violently, letting out a piercing shriek that made my ears ring. It yanked its claw back outside, stumbling away from the broken door. Dark fluid, something not quite blood, spattered on the porch. We peered over the couch to see it staggering in the snow, hissing and clutching its wounded arm. Then, with another shriek, it fled into the darkness, leaving a trail of deep footprints and streaks of blackish-red fluid. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, the footprints had vanished under fresh snowfall, but the broken glass and the weird fluid stains remained. Something about the salt seemed to repel or injure it. Maybe it was just a shock or pain. Maybe it had some supernatural vulnerability. Either way, we had a weapon, and that gave us a glimmer of hope. The creature might not be invincible, after all. Over the next few nights, armed with more rock salt, Eric and I tried to track it down, but the sightings became sporadic. A few people reported hearing bells or finding claw marks, but the attacks lessened. Some speculated it was retreating, weakened, or wounded. Others believed it was just waiting, biding its time. By New Year's Eve, the town was in an uneasy calm. No new incidents were reported. Some folks tried to pretend it never happened, eager to move on with their lives. The orchard remained a silent witness to all that had occurred, its scarred trees standing in rows under the winter sky. One crisp January morning, Eric decided to head back to his own life. Before he left, we shared a long hug, both of us uncertain if we'd truly driven Candy Cane Claus away or if it would return. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as his car disappeared down the snowy road, but I also felt alone, wondering when or if I'd ever see that striped monstrosity again. The winter months passed without further attacks. Spring thawed the town, bringing fresh leaves and new life to the orchard. Rumors of Candy Cane Claus faded to hushed stories, half-remembered nightmares, and local gossip. People wanted to believe it was gone, that maybe it had been a collective hysteria or a series of elaborate pranks. But I knew better. Sometimes, late at night, I still heard faint jingling in the wind or caught a glimpse of something tall and gaunt at the edge of my vision. When the next December rolled around, I put a salt line around my windows and doors, just in case. I tried to live as normally as possible after that. I focused on work, tried not to dwell on the horrifying events. Some nights I'd dream of those claws, the stripes swirling hypnotically. In my worst nightmares, I'd see it loom over me, bringing those razored edges to my throat. I'd wake up shaking, sometimes convinced I could hear its raspy breath echoing in my room. But as the years passed, the immediate terror dulled. Life went on. Birthdays came and went. New neighbors moved in. The orchard was eventually bought by a developer, who began clearing it out to build houses. That, I thought, might finally destroy the creature's hiding place once and for all. Then, nearly a decade later, around mid-December, Eric called me out of the blue. His voice was shaky, the same fear I remembered from our childhood creeping back into his tone. He said he'd been traveling for work and spent the night in a little motel. At 3 a.m, he heard faint jingling outside his window. When he got up to check, he saw a tall figure under a flickering streetlight, its claw raised in a mocking wave. As Eric watched, the figure tapped a red and white striped claw against a lamppost, then disappeared into the darkness. Eric was convinced it was Candy Cane Claus, following him, maybe waiting for the right moment to return in full force. My blood ran cold hearing that. After all that time, the nightmares, the illusions, maybe they weren't illusions after all. Maybe Candy Cane Claus was never confined to just our town. Maybe it roamed, visiting those who had seen it or challenged it. Eric asked me if I thought we'd ever be free of it. I didn't know what to say, except that we should stay vigilant. My mind conjured images of candy-striped spirals etched into motel doors, city alleys, or random suburban fences. It struck me that perhaps this was no longer just a local legend. It could be anywhere, everywhere. I wish I had a comforting resolution to all this, some explanation that ties it neatly in a bow. But the truth is, Candy Cane Claus remains a mystery. We don't know if it's a cursed spirit, a manifestation of holiday mischief, or something far older and darker. All I can tell you is that it's real, or at least it's as real as the terror it inspires. If you ever find strange spiral scratches around your home in December, or if you hear a distant jingling that sounds out of place, lock your doors, keep salt close, and pray it doesn't pay you a visit. For even if it's gone from my town, it might just be lurking in the shadows of yours, waiting for the cold winter nights to descend, waiting for someone to wander too close to that line between festivity and fear. And when it appears, those candy cane claws will glitter under moonlight, a deadly reminder that not all holiday spirits are benign. And if it taps on your window or scrapes your door, you'll know exactly who's come calling. Because sometimes, late at night, when I least expect it, I still find tiny pieces of broken candy canes arranged in neat rows on my doorstep. And each time, the spirals seem to be getting bigger, the claw marks deeper. I never see footprints in the snow, and I never hear the scratching until I step outside and see the signs. But I know it's there, somewhere in the darkness, watching, waiting, and occasionally reminding me that Candy Cane Claus does not forget. It only hides until it's hungry again.